Good morning. My name is Crystal Salvati, and I am a 2L Toll Public Interest Scholar at Penn Law. I will be moderating the first panel, Bought In and Gridlocked Out. Bought In and Gridlocked Out will examine the history, laws, and policies that contribute to transportation decisions. The panel will focus on transit deserts, a term coined by panelist Junfeng Zhao. The panel will give insight into how communities that lack transportation access are affected and how community members deal with these barriers. It will also discuss the social implications of transportation. This panel will go beyond local transportation issues and expand to global transportation issues to paint a broader picture of worldwide transportation. Finally, this panel looks towards the future of transportation and how transportation access, infrastructure, and policy decisions will impact different people. We are privileged to have 4 panelists here today to discuss transportation access. First, Dr. Junfeng Zhao is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Zhao is also the director of the Urban Information Lab at the University of Texas School of Architecture. He founded the Good Systems Executive Team and currently serves as its chair. This program uses artificial intelligence to create technology for the greater good. Noah Kazis is a legal fellow at the New York University's Furman Center. He's clerked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and worked for the New York City Law Department before transitioning to his current position at NYU. Dr. Mimi Scheller is the Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. Dr. Scheller also serves on a plethora of academic research boards. Notably, she sits on the board for the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the University of Pennsylvania and the Asia Mobilities Research Network at Konkuk University in South Korea. Professor Greg Schill is an associate professor of law at the Iowa College of Law and is a visiting professor at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. Professor Schill also has a passion for engineering and co-hosts the Densely Speaking Conversations About Cities, Economics, and Law podcast. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have a question during the event, please submit it to the Toll Public Interest Center through the chat function. We will then answer questions during Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. If you would like to have live subtitles for today's event, please click the button on the bottom of your Zoom screen that says Live Transcript. Then select Show Transcript, and it should provide live subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the option, please send a chat to the Toll Public Interest Center, and we will address it. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice during this panel. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in the confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, and if you are on the webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These passwords will tell us how long you attended the event. The first password is BIKE, B-I-K-E, BIKE. Now we'll begin our panel with the first question. How did we get to where we are today? What are some of the policy decisions that have created America's inequitable transportation systems, and what are some of the systemic forces at play?
Should I jump right in there? Sure, okay. So, it's a great question about the history of the policies that got us to where we are now. And I remember in terms of Philadelphia, when I first read the work of Jeff Zylstra, which is on the segregation of Philadelphia streetcars going back to the 1850s and 60s. And I had always thought of Rosa Parks as, the beginning of the desegregation of our urban public transit systems, but actually it started in Philadelphia long before that. And there's been a struggle over space and access to transport, since the abolition of slavery and the ways in which Black mobility has been controlled throughout the United States through policies of segregation and Jim Crow laws. Maybe some of you saw the film about the Green Book, right, which was for how African-American motorists could travel around the country safely. But I think in terms of law and policy, it's important to also note that the Federal Housing Act, back in the 1930s, the kind of New Deal era policies helped drive white suburbanization, and they excluded domestic and agricultural workers, for example, from the Social Security Act, and that created this uneven landscape of upward mobility that was racialized. And many of the New Deal policies then led into highway building, suburbanization, the creation of all the infrastructure we associate with American automobility. And we can see that in the landscape of cities like Philadelphia. And that was then followed by urban regeneration policies, which came at the expense, especially of African-American neighborhoods in the Northeast. We could look at different patterns that happened in out west in California. There's great work by Gina Carpio called Collisions at the Crossroads, which looks at Mexican American, Japanese American, and indigenous mobilities in California. So they're all deep patterns that are enmeshed with our legal system and the way in which it benefited some people and disadvantaged others.
Thank you for that insight. Would any of the other panelists like to contribute to that question? Moving along to the second question we have, Dr. Zhao has coined the term transit deserts in his research. He's defined transit deserts as a concept that looks at the gap between the level of transit service or supply and needs of a particular population, its demand. Dr. Zhao, can you speak a bit more about that? Also, is there a future in which transit deserts are reduced or eliminated?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Crystal, for the question. I want to introduce where and why I come up with the term. When I was a PhD student at the University of Washington, every weekend I will go to Chinatown to buy groceries. It's a pleasant ride in the summer, but not so pleasant in the winter. In one winter, when it's raining and it's dark outside, I was basically waiting in Chinatown for my bus to come. I waited an hour and a half. Later on, I realized maybe something wrong with the transportation system. At that time, I heard a term called food desert. Then I think, oh, maybe actually I live in a transit desert area. So that's where the term comes from. To go back to your question, transit desert is a measure to understand the demand and supply in US cities. So there's no US city without transit desert. We all have transit desert in all US cities. As a matter of fact, for Philadelphia, we have 8.5 population actually living in transit desert. Unfortunately, Philadelphia is one of the top 10 cities in terms of transit desert ranking. It's ranking number 9. How do we solve the transit desert problem? It's a very complicated problem. There's no one solution to fit all to solve the transit desert problem. For me, my understanding is the government, the scholars, the citizens, the industry should all work together to solve the transit desert problem. There's no easy way around. Thank you.
Can you just speak a little bit more about the forces at play? You said that there's no way around because there's so many players.
I'm happy to do that. So as we know, many shared mobility, shared micro mobility providers claim we are here in the city to improve the mobility for the citizens. We are here to solve the transit desert problem. Unfortunately, that's not the truth, because most of the companies are located their resources in high density, affluent area where there is already enough transportation service located. So because they are profit driven, so for most of vulnerable neighborhoods, as we can imagine, there's not so much profit there. So they don't deploy many equipment vehicles to this vulnerable neighborhood, so-called transit desert. So basically, they shift around the transportation service to from one location to another location. In a very short summary, shared mobility and shared micromobility is not a solution to transit desert problem. Another question is, can public agency like bus providers solve this problem? Not either, because we cannot provide a bus service to every neighborhood, and we cannot provide a bus service to 24/7. So that's not a solution. That's not a solution to transit desert. So what do? We should basically combine joint force from public to private to solve this problem. So that's my suggestion. Also, we should increase investment to public infrastructure. We're being basically turned away for public transportation, public infrastructure for too long, for way too long. So that's basically we suffer our own consequence for our strategies and policies. So that's my, I'm sorry, I don't have a crystal ball to figure out how to solve this problem, but I know there's no easy way around. And we have to do it right now. Otherwise, they're going to come back, haunt us for a long, long time in the future.
If I might add to that or expand a little bit on a dimension of that. So I think among people for whom transportation is not a daily concern, a group that's sometimes called sort of transportation privileged people, they may think that this is maybe not as widespread of a problem because it may not be obvious how many people rely on public transit outside of places like New York and San Francisco and Chicago. The latest figures I've seen show that 30% of households in Buffalo, for example, do not have a car. In Detroit, which is about 45 minutes where I grew up, about 25% of households do not have a car. And that's a household, right? So that means anybody in the household. That's potentially several people who don't have access to a car. I suppose there would be two, broadly speaking, sort of welfarist responses. One would be to buy cars for all those people. That would be expensive as a single outlay, but then would saddle lots of largely poor families with significant ongoing expenses, in addition to doubling down on the problems of a car-based transportation system. Also, it doesn't seem like there's any political will for that type of solution. Another option would be to use a different lever to improve transportation for people who don't have cars and for everybody else as well. And that, I think, is what Zheng was alluding to. And I agree that needs to be a big part of the solution.
Can I speak to the question that's been asked by one of the audience members about this? Cameron Adamas says, Karen Washington reframed food deserts as food apartheid. Is it worth viewing transit and infrastructure as apartheid instead? And I think that's such a good question, because the idea of deserts, whether food or transport, has been called into question a little bit because it seems to naturalize it. It makes it seem like it's almost like an ecological process that just sort of happened the way a desert happens. Whereas transit apartheid, gives an active agent of exclusion, right? That was trying to provide goods to some people and not provide them to other people, which is a little bit more like what has happened historically in the United States. And with that said, I think we can sort of think about how transit systems, not only do they bring access to certain neighborhoods, certain routes, certain groups, but they also construct real estate markets around that accessibility. And the question of uneven transport in US cities is closely linked to real estate development, uneven housing prices, and how people actually get priced out of their neighborhoods, or how neighborhoods get devalued because they don't have transit connections, which then has racial implications on who can accumulate value in their housing.
I just want to add one thing to this question. So living in a transit desert has a long-lasting impact on your mental health and physical health. Just imagine you plan out your daily schedule based on bus schedule. When the bus is coming, that's great. But when the bus is late, your whole day is basically messed up. So people doesn't understand this if they don't have this kind of experience. So it put a huge pressure on their mental health and physical health. There's also significantly prevent people, especially vulnerable people, for their upward moving opportunities. So that's something we cannot ignore at all.
Thank you for that interesting conversation and kind of all of the layers to the issues at hand. Professor Schill, you've written about how American lawmakers forced automobile transportation on Americans and how car dependency can be harmful to Americans. What about our rural areas? Are the transit concerns different there? How can we reduce automobile dependency in places where the distance between people and opportunities can be great?
So I think, transportation is a spatial technology. And that means that it looks different in different places and has different consequences in different places. The goal of transportation is to reach a place, not to go, right? It's not really about the movement, it's about the reaching of the destination or access in the urban planning literature. So in cities, public transportation or rapid transportation, shared transportation has a lot more logic to it because density is higher. It's easier to have more people walk, say, 2 blocks out of their way to catch a bus and then another block or 2 out of their way when they're off the trip to get to their destination. In a rural area where people are really dispersed, that doesn't work as well. The US used to have more robust intercity and just sort of regional rail and bus systems. In theory, it would be possible to bring those back. I don't think that that's going to be a very useful solution for most people who live in those places. I don't think that, I'm skeptical that there is a way to provide effective shared transit for day-to-day needs in low density, very low density areas, truly rural areas. But intercity rail and bus service, can be increased and would help. Those areas are shrinking. They're losing population. Depending how you measure them, probably about 20% of population now, versus much higher than that when there were those types of shared transit systems, say 100 years ago. I would focus on electrifying vehicles in those areas and making roads safer. There are a lot of steps that can be taken legally as well as in design to make roads safer for those who do depend on driving. And so I think the levers that I would use in rural areas are probably just different by and large from the ones that would be effective in cities.
Can I jump in again with one comment? Sorry to take up too much time, but Professor Schill just said that mobility is about accessibility. It's about getting to a place. It's not about the movement itself. And I would like to sort of reframe that a little, because the entire field of mobilities research that I am associated with working within and creating argues that the mobility itself and the experience of mobility is also a really crucial component here. And like when we speak about the idea of automobility, it's not just that cars are for accessing certain goods, it's that automobility is a cultural complex. It's the dominant system of mobility. And it's the quintessential manufactured object. So a number of industries have been built around it with national importance. It's the major item of individual consumption after housing. So it offers status and what we call sign values, right? To drive a car, to have a car, what kind of car you have is associated with success, freedom, family, masculinity, all sorts of things. It's also the dominant culture that sustains major discourses on, what constitutes the good life and what is necessary for appropriate citizenship, and also forms of security and safety in terms of this protected bubble that we call the carcoon. So in all these ways, there's a big difference between getting somewhere, in a car and getting somewhere in a bus, and that matters, right, to people. And when we see the pushback against active transport, right, bicycling, what we see is the rise of a sort of fossil fuel car culture backlash in many cities in the US and in rural areas. Look at the truckers' protest happening in Ottawa, Canada right now, right? Those are meaningful, those vehicles are meaningful, and the forms of mobility are meaningful.
Yeah, just to clarify briefly, I think it's the public policy objective of transportation to enhance access. Individuals will make consumption choices around mobility, status, comfort, and so on. And we should expect a lot of heterogeneity of preferences and capacities there. We can regulate for safety and so on. But when we're trying to ensure something, what I think we ought to be trying to ensure or subsidize or promote is access. And if people want to get there with a gold-plated vehicle, then I don't think that's a public policy goal to help facilitate that.
Right, but it means just because we build something like a bike lane, for example, doesn't mean that all people will feel that they have access to that, even if the infrastructure is there. The argument of groups like the Untokening and People for Mobility Justice is that individuals have different experiences, embodied experiences of mobility, and that changes how they access public space, depending on race, gender, class, sexuality, age, and people with disabilities having different ways of approaching those infrastructures and spaces.
I mean, that's absolutely true, and you can't go wrong underestimating the importance of cars in particular to sort of American culture in all the ways that Dr. Schiller just said. But I do want to push back slightly about sort of the malleability of these cultural forces and sort of what's causal and what's not. Because I'm coming in from New York City, and in New York City, one of the things that's a status symbol is taking the right kind of train to work, right? The commuter rail from the suburbs, right? That's another way to create a status hierarchy. Now, I'm not saying status hierarchies, as embodied through transportation technologies is a good thing, but that people are really adaptable and can bring their desire to have a hierarchical, culturally affirming commute, I guess, to a lot of contexts. So I think as you change the context, those cultures can change more quickly than I think sometimes we let on. People are good at naturalizing and self-justifying, I think, and fitting things into all kinds of class, racial, gendered hierarchies. So I just don't want us to sort of take car culture as a given, because I think that as you change the laws and as you change the policies, the way these deep cultural forces sort of squeeze themselves into the shape that policy gives us can change actually quite quickly, quite dramatically.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely that culture can change, but also that forms of sustainable transport can become a kind of green moral virtue, right? That some people have access to and other people don't. So we just have to be careful about assuming that everybody should and can engage in green forms of sustainable transport if they're not able to appropriate that mobility.
Thank you all for that. I'm going to now move on to the next question, which is, Dr. Scheller, you've written about urban centers, including Philadelphia, and how they were once seeing a decline in driving that eventually leveled off. However, there has been a noticeable increase in driving since the pandemic began. Considering the dangers to individuals, communities, and the environment posed by driving, how do we decrease automobile dependency in urban and suburban areas while ensuring that Black and Brown residents have equitable access to public transit systems. Additionally, I would love to pan out a bit and have you answer, how does mobility in US cities compare to cities in other countries?
Okay, thanks, Crystal. It's a big question, but partly I think you're referring to patterns that were arising from about 2007 to about 2014. There was a leveling off in the growth of automobility and a possible decline, where we saw that the number of miles per year that people were driving in the United States started to fall. Car drivers' licensing began to fall. A younger generation began to say that they were less interested in driving and they didn't necessarily want to drive. There was a move back to city centers in that period, and the sort of, reclaiming of the walkable, livable city, and the beginnings of the push in the United States to build better bike infrastructure, walkability, and livable cities, a whole set of policies that kind of traveled around the country. And that was a really important moment, but it then started to sort of peter out, and there began to be a counter force that showed there was actually not this huge generational shift, and that actually many of that younger generation were also moving to suburbs. And it became a question of whether we were just seeing a kind of blip of gentrification of a kind of college-age professional group who wanted to stay in the city center, but then as they kind of got a bit older, were moving back to suburbs, were purchasing cars, and so on. Fast forward to today and the pandemic, we've seen a massive decline in public transportation use, right? And it has not bounced back fully. We've seen increase in driving, and also people kind of wanting to own cars as a kind of safety valve, right? We've seen these huge price increases in the used car market, for example. And also a pattern of people moving out of city centers, especially like wealthy, more privileged folks who could sort of move to rural places, vacation places, right? Own second homes or get Airbnbs, which actually drives up kind of driving back and forth by using cars. So the sort of hoped for decline in automobility did not really happen. At the same time, a number of cities have embraced those policies. And so the pandemic also brought that huge push to kind of implement open streets, build out more bike lanes, kind of seize the moment to sort of put in that infrastructure that they had been kind of pushing for a long time. Now, every time that's happened in US cities, there has also been a backlash against it. So there are business owners, there are people in neighborhoods that feel not connected, people who are automobile dependent, who will push back against those policies. So it's always a struggle. It's kind of one step forward, two steps back, but we are getting better at building that infrastructure. One really important policy we see here, I'm just outside of Boston, and our new mayor, Michelle Wu, is trying to implement free public transit, right? And is making several bus routes free and hopes to extend that further. So that's just cleared the city of Boston, and then some of the surrounding cities, Cambridge and Somerville, are also trying to figure out how to implement free bus routes on certain main arteries. And as soon as that pilot began last year, there has been a large increase in bus use, right? It's gone back up again despite the pandemic. So with masking and vaccination and everything else, people are coming back to buses, especially if they're free. And I think that's a really important policy for US cities to look at, is how do we fund transit differently? Because when you make the buses free, it also speeds up the bus service because you have quicker onboarding and people coming onto the bus because they don't have to worry about tickets. It saves the transit agency money if they don't have to have that ticketing system built, right? The ticket collection and the fares and the counting and all the information and everything that goes into that. And so there should be a more sensible, rational way to use taxes, public money, just as we do to subsidize highways and road building, as we've seen in our infrastructure bill, which has a huge amount of money for more road building. We can also subsidize public transit as a public good, and that's what we need to do. And I'll just add, in terms of the international comparison, that European cities do this all the time, right? European cities, Latin American cities, Asian cities, African cities, and East European socialist, right, former socialist area cities, all subsidize public transport in different ways and see it as a public good. We're kind of one of the few places that does not.
Just on that point, as seeing transportation as a public good, does that also call for a shift in the culture?
I mean, I think we have that cultural tradition, right, in some places, right? Like, you know, we have the New York City MBTA, which is an amazing system. We have, you know, Philadelphia's system, despite what Professor Zhao said of the limits of it. I mean, it is a good structure to the system, right? If it were funded sufficiently. So I think we do have those models here. We have a different relationship between our city centers and our suburbs. So this kind of regional question. And one of the things we see in Philadelphia, for example, is that the suburban rail system, it works, like operates in a different kind of equipment and a different fare rates than the inner city, you know, bus and subway system. And so I think we need to think about the unification of those systems, and also the other kinds of measures that could be taken, as Professor Zhao was saying, to link to the last mile, right? What are the links that people can use, whether it's private or shared mobility, you know, shared bike systems, shared electric micro mobility, to get to the stops on the system and to make the fare structures more equitable.
Can I quickly comment on that? I was thinking, like, just imagine all of us living a parallel universe where we subsidize public infrastructure and bus system significantly. Maybe we have a different lifestyle or habits. And actually, we don't need to live in a parallel universe. We have our very similar cities in European countries, basically. As Professor Scheller said, this is what they're doing. So that's the first comment. Second comment, I would say, public transportation or mobility is a human right. It's not just a public good. It's basically, we should have a opportunity and resources to move freely. So basically, in this case, I should say like mobility, accessibility is one of the human rights.
Thank you both for that. On to the next question. Mr. Kazis, your recent paper, Transportation, Land Use, and the Source of Hyperlocalism, analyzes the politics of transportation decisions in big cities. Mr. Kazis, would you please explain some of the major barriers to transportation policy change and some of the ways we can work to reduce or eliminate those barriers? After that, I welcome the rest of the panelists to join in the conversation and give their opinions about how to approach the barriers Mr. Kazis lays out.
Yeah, well, that paper really was looking at a subset of transportation projects. So those sort of in an existing right-of-way, so a bus lane or a bike lane or a change to the sidewalk, not so much, a new highway or a new transit line. So there I was talking about sort of the way that the political process is really set up to create an immense number of informal, every so often formal, but mostly informal vetoes, and therefore protect the status quo. And we know the status quo in our transportation system is incredibly flawed for reasons that we've started to talk about on this panel that we'll be talking about all day. Deaths from crashes, deaths from pollution, and asthma rates. We've talked about transit deserts. And all of this, of course, is completely unequally distributed by race, by class, by neighborhood. So anything that demands consensus or near consensus with opposition slowing or scuttling products locks in that status quo. And our legal system, or really our policy choices, and a lot of this isn't in law, our policy choices create all these opportunities for those vetoes and all of these incredibly high bars for what constitutes consensus. So, lots of outreach, lots of community meetings, lots of council member involvement. And if any step something goes wrong, change doesn't happen. And so you're stuck with what you've got. Just as one example for Philadelphia, you guys recently passed a bill saying that you need legislative approval for new bike lanes. And obviously the logical result of that is that you stopped building them, because that's the way the legislative process works. The more vetoes, the less change. So that paper was talking a little bit about ways, it was mostly really about land use, but a little bit of ways to change the community process to allow community voice without so much veto power. All right, so some cities like Boston have had a lot of success flipping the community process around. So instead of saying, we've got a hypothetical change that looks scary, do you like it? They say, we did the change as a pilot program. Is it working? And then you have like a constituency of people who are already benefiting from it, who can see the reality. Some of the fears are shown to be overblown. I think that's been very successful. I've observed, I think, a lot more success in community processes that instead of asking for a yes or a no, which is a question that always gets you a no, ask how or where, something like that. I think shifting towards data-driven decision making is really important when we're talking about things like traffic deaths and like the climate. These are not matters that are just up for personal opinion or majority preference of the people who tend to show up, but rather the stakes are high enough that we need to really take into account what's actually happening and what works. And just broadly restoring our comfort at the local level with pluralism, with the idea that there isn't one community voice that's going to give you that, yes, this is what the community wants, but rather there's inherent disagreement in any place, in any community, and how you move forward from there. But just to zoom out to sort of the larger question about other barriers for other kinds of transportation change, there's sort of all the standard issues of a political system that is not only biased against change, but is particularly biased against change that might benefit low-income people and people of color. With transportation, I think you have the extra layer that federal and state control of the resources means that those resources are really shifted to rural and suburban areas just based on representation. And that sort of predates the recent alignment of the parties with, sort of rural and urban interests. Even when that was more bipartisan, there still was just this deep structural bias towards, or really against cities in the way we allocated transportation dollars. I think something that's really an underestimated barrier is the way that we use transportation as a jobs program. And that's the way it's been slotted into our political process. I think that makes it much harder to use it as a climate tool or as a safety tool or as an accessibility tool. I think it drives up costs in ways that makes change really difficult, and just it's causing us to have the wrong conversation too often. And then I think the hardest one is the way that land use and transportation are tied together, right? You can build all the transit lines you want, and as long as you have 1 acre lots of single family housing, no one is going to use that transit because, as Professor Schill was saying at the beginning, it just doesn't work geometrically. It's not the right mode for that built environment. So to really get the outcomes you want, you have to be changing land use and transportation at the same time. But now you're coordinating federal, state, and local change. That's hard. You're hitting people in their homes, which is maybe the most sensitive form of politics. That's really hard. And you're trying to deal with 70 years of intense investment in one form of the built environment that it's really hard to change overnight. It's just the trillions of dollars that we've all invested in our homes, even before you get to the roads. It's an incredible coordination problem. And then we talked about car culture, which I think is sort of in the background of all of this as well. So those are some of the barriers that I see as most salient to sort of improving our system.
I was just going to say, I think the connection that Mr. Kazis has drawn between land use and transportation is really critical. There was a decision made, Yoni Freemark has a paper on this, something like 60 years ago, to split off land use from the US DOT ambit and to split transportation off from HUD, you know, during basically the urban renewal era. And that's, you can see that as kind of an original sin. I mean, I don't know that that would have solved everything, but certainly trying to compartmentalize these two, it's created a lot of problems. We've seen, everybody I think has seen sort of failed transit experiments where you have the right solution for the wrong land use. But also we see this in Iowa, sometimes you have actually the wrong land use for the transportation. So sometimes you'll see medium density suburban development, like a ton of townhouses that are off of a highway. And there'll be one development right next to another and then another. But because they're an island, because they're all zoned for housing, and it's illegal to build a corner store or a grocery store or whatever, and let alone an office or a factory, everybody has to drive to get everywhere. And so I think the assumption historically of land use scholars has been that if you have the density, then the politics for transportation will follow. And so what you want is density first, and then you're going to get a kind of groundswell for transportation reform, or maybe not in every case, but at least that's an efficient way to generate political will for transportation. And I have to say, I don't find that persuasive. I think the two are linked, and you have to sort of try to find the right levers that will use both. So I don't think there is a silver bullet, but conditioning US federal highway money, which is the elephant in the room here, conditioning that on facilitative land use reform. So not, just to sort of state the obvious, not turning rural areas into Manhattan, but taking out restrictions on building smaller dwellings, whether it's smaller houses or even big, medium or large houses, but on smaller lots. So lot size reform and minimum parking requirements, eliminating those, and allowing multi-floor density. So, using federal dollars to do that. The new transportation bill does that, but not with the existing pot of money, which is tens and tens of billions a year. It has a kind of a carrot approach, which is what's been tried in the past. I think this one has more promise, and I think this administration is taking more of interest in this. So the results might be better. But I think at the end of the day, when you're throwing gobs of money at highway expansions, in Iowa, we're in the middle of building a big interchange between I-80 and 280, 80 and 380, which really there already is an interchange there, but they're making a bigger one. Originally, it was going to be like 200 or 250 million. Now it's looking like it's going to be closer to 400 million. I wouldn't be surprised if it's higher than that by the time it's done. As Mr. Kazis was saying, it's become a jobs program, and it has widespread political support. So, this is the elephant in the room, is all the funding for this to then also do little one-off projects that generate 2 blocks of a bike lane next to a couple of apartment buildings is not going to be a serious solution.
And I mean, I think that's why there's been this alternative proposal under the name of the Green New Deal, which seeks to shift how we think about public investment in transportation, but also in affordable housing and in workforce transitions, and the idea that you can't just do these things separately, but that if we want to reduce our fossil fuel dependence, that we need to have a set of policies that help people who have not been advantaged by the current system, right, to be able to transition into a new green workforce, and for our industries to be built around electrification, but that also requires affordable housing protection. So it's a whole package of kind of related policies, which has gotten nowhere in Congress, as we know. So we're in this sort of gridlocked system in terms of passing this kind of stuff, but it's not like we don't know what needs to happen. And the question is, can we build the kind of political constituencies that see that as desirable transformations?
Just in terms of that, connecting to what Mr. Kazis said, the idea of kind of getting rid of these legislative barriers altogether, is that feasible on a federal level?
I mean, you're not going to get rid of the Senate. Like, it would be great. I'm all for it, but no.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
I was going to
I think,
reframe it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think I'm the only person here that has 4 Republican senators in a sense, because I'm between 2 schools that each have 2 representing their state, and I second the sentiment that the Senate is a challenge for transportation reform. My colleague Sarah Bronin, who teaches at the Cornell Urban Planning School, and I have an article, and based on a comment to USDOT, urging reform of the Federal Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is one of many ostensibly technical, but really also policy-oriented rules that are applied by federal and state transportation agencies that kind of cement the interests of the transportation privileged and systematically disadvantaged people who don't have that same degree of access. So they are undertaking a revision of that was actually started in the last administration and of that manual. And there is some energy. There's like 26,000 comments that were submitted. So I think it's possible to nip away at some of the specifics, to drive reform. Even I guess you could call that from the top down. I'm a little uncomfortable calling it that because there has been such a consistent support among transportation advocates at the grassroots level for years for change, but the rules themselves would be changed by definition at the agency level. So I think there's some potential there. In other words, that sidesteps the legislative process or is separate from the legislative process. But I think it's challenging. For example, conditioning federal highway funding on land use reform, what I was describing, that would need to be legislative. I don't think an agency would have authority to do that, or at least not with the current makeup of the Supreme Court. So, at some point there is a barrier.
I just want to comment on Dr. Sher's comment. The separation between transportation and land use create a huge problem for our country. So we can build a road and we can build infrastructure anywhere, but if there's no corresponding or proper land use surrounding that location, that's basically useless. So I would say the separation between USDOT and HUD is they should think more in their action items, and they should work together to solve the transportation infrastructure problem for this country. That's my overall comment.
And I was going to chime in on the question about our federal, state, and local, political system. And there's a great question from Vincent Cack, I think, that says to comment on voting rights and mobility when there are only a half dozen voting sites in a county or 1 voting site in a township, as in Pennsylvania. Lack of mobility affects voting patterns. And I think we could even broaden that and talk about the systematic limitation of voting access that's happening across the country now, especially in Republican-controlled states, but also the gerrymandering of districts in both Democratic and Republican states. And what this means for, how we will change our transportation and land use and Green New Deal policies, and all of this is going to depend on the defense of voting rights. And, it takes us right back to the civil rights movement and to the efforts to desegregate transportation, schools, public spaces, required a push for electoral power, for voting rights, for civil rights, and for that kind of political empowerment. And, there's crucial struggles happening around that all over the country, which I think are going to have some determination on what happens in the future.
Thank you. And finally, what do you all hope that attendees will take away from this conversation today?
Who's first? Okay, I'll go first again. I've been advocating for the idea of mobility justice, which means kind of framing our discussion about transport access and transport equity in slightly broader terms, and really thinking about mobility justice as a broad terrain of political struggle over who has rights to movement and who does not, who controls the mobility and the immobility of others, how is our right to dwell, to remain in place, even affected. That is, if we think about the number of migrants in the United States and non-citizen Americans who are here now, how are their rights to mobility impacted? If we think of the people who are imprisoned in the United States, right, that's a mobility justice issue too. Thinkers like Charles T. Brown have used the concept of arrested mobility to talk about the policing of Black and Brown mobilities in this country, also Indigenous mobilities, and of course the crucial issues around disabling environments and disability rights, critical disability studies, which also have to be on the table here for discussion. All of those are mobility justice issues. And I think we need that conversation to happen at that broader scale of intersecting mobilities and systems of kind of disenfranchisement and exclusion. And how do we bring all those voices to the table? I think our planning around transportation and urban land use and decision-making need to bring in more voices, more people have to be empowered to feel like they're part of that decision-making process, and then we might have better outcomes. That's what I would like us to take away.
I would quickly follow up on Dr. Sheller's comment. The takeaway I want people to have is when we design or planning our make a policy for transportation and transportation related issues, we should thinking the transportation system is for all the people within the cities, not for the 90% or 85% or 75%. What I mean is we should design our system for people with low income, with minorities, with mental or physical disabilities. Many times we forget about their existence. So we're trying to ignore this, and we should design our system for people with autism, with Down syndrome, or with all kinds of mental disabilities. So I would strongly argue if we're trying to think we're not a part of them, but we never know. It's like we really never know. So the systems for all the residents or non-citizens, all the residents within the city, within the regions, not just for a select group of the population. That's the comment I want the audience to take away from this panel.
I guess I'll hop in. I think what I think is most important to communicate about transportation is the size of the problem. So, and the degree to which it is a policy choice. In the US, about 100,000 people a year are killed by the use of cars. That includes 40,000 or so in traffic crashes, plus almost 60,000 in premature deaths from pollution. And every wealthy country in the world has a lot of motorization, meaning high degree of car ownership and a lot of car use. So that's true even in these, transit and walking paradises that you might see people extolling on Twitter. But it's really uniquely costly in the United States in a social sense, our system. And that's compared not just to those paradises, but also to places like Canada and Australia, where the death rate, for example, from traffic crashes is half or less what it is in the US. And these are not places that benefit from an endowment of highly dense urban areas. These are not places that develop before the car. In fact, much of their development postdates the land use development of the United States. So, I think there's a lot that we can do to reduce the suffering and the climate change impact of depending on cars, even if we have a highly motorized society that mainly gets around by cars. The second piece to that, and it's just as important, is the distributive effects of this. So these costs, are though they're huge for the whole society, they're not evenly distributed. And low-income people, people with disabilities, people of color, and people with all kinds of issues. You'd be surprised. 100 million Americans don't have driver's licenses. Now, some of them are too young, right? But about a third of them aren't too young. And even for the 2/3 that are, many parents would feel comfortable sending their 14-year-old on an errand to buy a jug of milk if it were safe for them to walk there to do that. And so we have to think about how we're depriving people of access to the necessities of daily life and the pleasures of daily life by requiring de facto that everybody reach their destination by car. And the deaths also, the traffic deaths and the pollution deaths, as well as non-fatal conditions that severely impede daily function, are very regressively distributed. So people of color historically have, and today, suffer much higher rates of asthma and various types of cancers and traffic deaths, especially as pedestrians. So I think there are sort of society-wide concerns that we ought to have, as well as distributional ones that go to the most vulnerable people in society.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. So I'm not sure I've got a new answer to like what should the takeaway be. But one thing that I think we haven't talked about enough, just sort of as a closing thought, is that a lot of the big policy levers, we've been talking, I feel like, a lot about transit and to some extent biking and walking, but really the big policy levers are on the car side. It's the stick, and that means it sticks, not just carrots. And I think it's really important for understanding that, you know, it's not a political free lunch. I mean, not even that transit is, but it's really hard, right? Like, you know, what European cities do, it's not just they invest in transit, but that they have, you know, gas prices double or triple what we have in this country. They've got enormous excise taxes on the purchase of a new car. Parking is expensive. It is rigidly enforced, you know, in a way that things are lax here. So that's part of the solution. It sort of has to be, I think, if you look at what actually works. And then there's also, you know, the regulation of the design of cars and the use of cars in terms of safety, in terms of emissions, you know, things that the US has historically been pretty lax on. But those might be even harder politically. But when we're thinking about sort of the path forward, I do think it's really important to remember that the car is where the action is, because that is where the numbers are.
I'd like to thank you all once again for your insights and answers to our questions. We're now going to transition to the rest of the Q&A questions from the audience. So first, Alejandro asks, Virginia Parks, a planning professor at UC Irvine, once told me that one of the problems of transit in the US is that buses, which is a technology that mostly fits better the US urban form, it has no champions or advocates that have fetishes in the Marxist sense, the way that trains and bikes do, and users tend to be low income, subaltern, with few examples of engagement and advocacy, such as the BRU case on LA. Do any of you have any comments about that?
I'll just say thanks for that question. And that's a reference to the Bus Riders Union, which advocated in Los Angeles for a more fair and just distribution of public investment in the bus system there with some success. And I think that what we're seeing now, this current movement for free public transit, for free buses, is a really interesting development in the United States, which, as I mentioned earlier, could begin to build a bit of a constituency around bus advocacy. I think the other thing we're seeing is just to put it out there that, I mean, there's a big sort of push for the transition to connected, autonomous, shared electric vehicle systems. That will include buses, right? Autonomous electric buses. There's going to be electric school buses. There's going to be fleets of autonomous truck, heavy goods vehicles, right? So there's big shifts that are happening from the sort of market and industrial side of things. And it will be really interesting to see how those play out and how fairly they're distributed. Electric school buses, for example, would have a huge impact on air quality in low-income neighborhoods, especially for children. And that would be fantastic if something like that happens.
Thank you. Maya asks, there are a few examples of cities across the US rethinking the impacts of highways with success. Pittsburgh, Milwaukee's highway removal, and Atlanta's historic information projects, for example, and some that are facing roadblocks or have no clear path forward. How does rethinking the disparate impact of US highways contribute to equity, mobility justice, and a form of historical reparations?
So, oh, go ahead, Greg. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say briefly, these things are great, and I'm happy to see support for them in the new infrastructure bill, as well as local support. One thing that I think is a mistake among past projects is so to make these highways, they blew up tons and tons of housing and businesses, churches, and other stuff, but it was like they did carpet bombing along the route of the highway. Then they put in the highway, and the highway causes ongoing harms through pollution and noise and separating communities and so on. And so in Boston, for example, they then put the highway below the ground and substituted for it just a linear park, a very long, big park, sometimes in areas that had other park access. And that is basically leaving a scar there and a missed opportunity to build housing and other usable space that would be in demand, especially in a place like Boston that really has a housing crunch. So I think, as these removals happen, I think we have to be careful not to automatically default to just building green space. Green space is great, but a strip of green space that is exactly where the highway used to be may not be the optimal use of that space. Instead, we should think about trying to put back some of the things, not literally the things that were there before, but trying to rebuild some of the urban form that was there.
And I just wanted to chime in there on the question of historical reparations, because I think that is really important. We opened this session with acknowledgement of Indigenous and Native land, but we could also mention that University of Pennsylvania, the law school in particular, my former institution, Drexel University, are built on the land that was formerly the Black Bottom neighborhood of Philadelphia, which was a major African-American business district and residential area. And they were forced out through eminent domain in an urban renewal project in the 60s and 70s. So we still owe reparations for those kinds of projects. And I think the highway removal projects need to acknowledge the reparative aspect of this and involve communities in designing, co-designing, and planning what kind of reparative justice they are seeking.
Before we jump to the last question that we have time for, I just want to say that the next CLE password is access. That is ACCESS, access, ACCESS. One more question. Jonathan asks, the welfare residency constitutional litigation of the 60s and 70s surfaced the right of travel from state to state. Is this concept relevant now? And if so, how?
Sure, I can jump in on that. So it's not directly relevant to sort of questions of transportation as transportation, right? When they say mobility in those cases, they're really talking about sort of the right to move, to relocate from place to place, and very, except in a couple really specific instances, they're not talking about how you get there, right? So you don't have any right under that framework to have a bus or a train or a car or a highway that takes you from point A to point B. It's about the discrimination you may face for having gone from point A to point B. So like in a doctrinal sense, no. But I think it is worth asking whether there are constitutional values that can be surfaced as sort of not a litigation strategy in any way, but that are sort of part of how we should understand the role of transportation in and mobility more broadly in sort of the political framework of our system, and whether sort of the valorization of mobility has broader resonances. So one place I think about this is sort of, I think there's a lot of debates with really important arguments on both ends of sort of, should neighborhoods change, right? Like in terms of the composition of who lives there, and sort of what are the pros and cons of, you know, just changing the places we live in, changing, and people moving, and people being forced to move, or people choosing to move based on changing situations. And I think these sort of questions of mobility in the right to mobility constitutional sense can actually be quite helpful for sort of unlocking or giving us language to think about some of those questions, but I don't think they're transportation questions in any meaningful sense.
I just quickly jump in for the last question. Casey Carr asked the remote work and the online work, will that affect the transportation system? So this panel had talked about transportation. If we think about transportation, it basically means accessibility to opportunity. Yes, because pandemic, a lot of people work from home and start to doing remote work all the time, but still many people doesn't have a high-speed internet access. This is just accessibility, another type of discrimination against the opportunity to these people. So this is just another form of lack of access to opportunity. I don't think we should let this happen. Like we just switch, say, okay, now it's nobody taking the bus, and we just ignore the bus system, and we let another type of lack of opportunity happen. So that's something I want to point out. So basically, we just talk about accessibility to opportunities.
I completely agree with that. And on that point, 80% of trips in the US pre-COVID were not work trips. So people need transportation in order to be able to access grocery stores, caregiving responsibilities, schools, and so on, especially women who, historically have used, first of all, they're a majority of transit users. Second, historically have needed access to a broader range of destinations than have men. So I think there's a risk that because our transit systems are, despite that, largely designed around commutes, that they may wither if they don't adapt. And so they probably, if remote work becomes, even just moderately common among a subsection of workers who would otherwise have taken transit, then the positive side of that would be that it frees up some resources to reallocate routes and so on, especially for non-fixed route infrastructure. For things like rail, I think it's going to be a challenge, and transit systems are going to need to be innovative to try to increase ridership levels.
I'd like to thank you all once again for your comments and expertise. I'd also like to thank the audience for attending. The next panel is At a Crossroads, Mobility and Access to Resources, which will begin at 10:15. Thank you all.